it's the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Get the homeless off the streets and a place to live. Bottom up economics got a lot to give. The folks struggling with ends to make ends meet. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Stimulate the economy the right way. Universal basic income all the way. The single mother with kids, what to do? 2 G's per month cash in her pocket cool. Universal basic income cash flow. Economic stimulation, that's the way to go. Money in at the bottom, poor and middle class. Economic stimulation when they spend the cash. Bottom up economics, that's the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. It's time to roll with the bottom up at last. Throw the top down system in the trash. Bottom up economics is what it be. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Bottom up economics, 2 G's a month. The mission to end poverty, that's what's up. Poor middle class rich gon' get the cheese. With the primary focus on the least of these. Bottom up economics is the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Bottom up economics and universal basic income. BGMGproductions.com. B Goines and M Goines. Welcome to Political Facts with Byron Goines
and Michelle Goines.
The song you heard is entitled Bottom Up Economics and Universal Basic Income and is available to purchase at bgmgproductions.com. We're on a mission to educate and inform our listeners on everything concerning politics that they will not hear through any other media. This is broadcast number 3 of 3 consecutive broadcasts dedicated to thoroughly explaining our legislative proposal for $2,000 in monthly United States government guaranteed lifetime universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. We will be submitting our legislative proposal to the incoming Biden administration, along with House members and Senate members. This lecture is available in its entirety for purchase at bgmgproductions.com. Let's get into part 3 of the lecture. Now, the Federal Reserve's income comes from interest on government securities it acquires with no money, as it creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Concerning the funding of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. The Federal Reserve is not funded by congressional appropriations. Its operations are financed primarily from the interest earned on the securities it owns. Securities acquired in the course of the Federal Reserve's open market operations. The fees received for price services provided to depository institutions such as check clearing, funds transfers, and automated clearinghouse operations are another source of income. This income is used to cover the cost of those services. After payment of expenses and transfers to surplus, limited to an aggregate of $10 billion, all the net earnings of the Federal Reserve banks are transferred to the U.S. Treasury. Now, the Federal Reserve earns interest on securities it acquires with no money. And let me repeat, it creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Concerning open market operations, which is the procedure through which the Federal Reserve acquires its income and sets monetary policy, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. Open market operations, OMOs, the purchase and sale of securities in the open market by a central bank, are a key tool used by the Federal Reserve in the implementation of monetary policy. The short-term objective for open market operations is specified by the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. Before the global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve used OMOs to adjust the supply of reserve balances so as to keep the federal funds rate, the interest rate at which depository institutions lend reserve balances to other depository institutions overnight, around the target established by the FOMC. Concerning the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. The term monetary policy refers to the actions undertaken by a central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, to influence the availability and cost of money and credit to help promote national economic goals. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 gave the Federal Reserve responsibility for setting monetary policy. The Federal Reserve controls the three tools of monetary policy: open market operations, the discount rate, and reserve requirements. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is responsible for the discount rate and reserve requirements, and the Federal Open Market Committee is responsible for open market operations. Using the three tools, the Federal Reserve influences the demand for and supply of balances that depository institutions hold at Federal Reserve banks, and in this way alters the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate at which depository institutions lend balances at the Federal Reserve to other depository institutions overnight. Again, let me repeat because I want to make sure you understand this important fact. The Federal Reserve's income comes primarily from the interest on government securities it acquires with no money, as it creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. These transactions are completed through open market operations, which the Federal Reserve controls, as stated in the information I just shared with you from the Federal Reserve website, as open market operations are listed as one of the tools of monetary policy it controls, along with the discount rate and reserve requirements. Now, how does the Federal Reserve create money out of thin air to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system through buying securities in open market operations? Through monetizing debt, as debt, credit, liabilities, assets, and balance sheets are what enable the Federal Reserve to create money. The Federal Reserve utilizes a credit to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system. Remember, the Federal Reserve purchases the securities through creating money out of thin air as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit came from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. The Federal Reserve website PDF, entitled Conducting Monetary Policy, in Figure 3.3 on page 35 gives the following example of how the Federal Reserve conducts open market operations. When the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, sets monetary policy that, for example, requires adding liquidity to the banking system to spur economic activity, it instructs the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's open market desk to purchase U.S. Treasury securities in the open market. Number 1, decides to reduce the target for the federal funds rate. Number 2, instructs the Federal Reserve Bank of New York desk to purchase securities. Number 3, purchases securities in the highly liquid market for U.S. Treasury securities from one of the designated approved primary dealers. Number 4, ensure that the market for the U.S. Treasury securities is liquid. In other words, they are always willing to sell securities and always willing to buy securities. Number 5, credits account that the primary dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in exchange for securities. Number 6, the securities acquired are assets, and the bank accounts credited with the payment are liability items on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Number 7, with the added funds in their accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, banks can make more loans to businesses and individuals. Number 8, with increased opportunity to borrow, businesses and individuals are able to purchase mortgages, cars, and other items, boosting spending in the economy. Now, in this example, where did the Federal Reserve get the money to pay the primary dealer for the securities? The money came from nowhere. It created the money out of thin air that was placed in the system as a credit to the primary dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. According to the example in conducting monetary policy in figure 3.3 on page 35, the Federal Reserve has no money to pay the primary dealer in order to purchase the securities. In essence, the process of adding liquidity to the banking system begins with the Federal Reserve making a securities purchase with no money to begin with, as it creates money out of thin air that is placed in the system as a credit to the primary dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Remember, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and places it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the process is listed in plain sight on the Federal Reserve website, as I have just shown you. The Federal Reserve does not touch tax money. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to add liquidity to the banking system. In the following audio clip from the television show 60 Minutes, posted to YouTube by CBS, listen to the words of former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014, as Ben Bernanke confirms these facts concerning adding liquidity to the banking system. Now listen carefully to the words of Bernanke as money creation out of thin air is confirmed.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed.
Now, as I have proven unequivocally, the Federal Reserve, through typing whatever amount it is in need of through some keystrokes, creates the money it needs to purchase the securities in order to add liquidity to the banking system. The money was created out of thin air, as the Federal Reserve has no money to begin with. Think about this. An entity that has no money whatsoever types some keystrokes to create the amount of money it needs. When you have no money to make a purchase, Can you power up your computer and type some keystrokes to create the amount of money you need? Of course you can't. But the Federal Reserve can when it purchases securities in order to add liquidity to the banking system. Now remember, the Federal Reserve purchases securities by typing some keystrokes to create the amount of money it needs. These keystrokes create the money out of thin air as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. Ben Bernanke also confirms these facts in a 2012 college lecture posted on YouTube by the Federal Reserve. Now listen carefully to this audio clip, as these words of Bernanke also confirm how the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. Also, remember the question I addressed earlier. Where does the Federal Reserve get money to begin the process of adding liquidity to the banking system by buying securities in open market operations? Through monetizing debt, as debt, credit, liabilities, assets, and balance sheets are what enable the Federal Reserve to create money. Remember, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and places it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank, and this is also addressed by Ben Bernanke in the following audio clip.
Now, you might ask the question, well, the Fed's going out and buying $2 trillion of securities. How do we pay for that? And the answer is that we paid for those securities by crediting the bank accounts of the people who sold them to us. And those accounts at the banks showed up as reserves that the banks would hold with the Fed. So the Fed is a bank for the banks. Banks can hold deposit accounts with the Fed, essentially, and those are called reserve accounts. And so as the purchases of securities occurred, the way we paid for them was basically by increasing the amount of reserves that banks had in their accounts with the Fed. So you can see this here. This is the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet. Of course, assets and liabilities, including capital, have to be equal. So the liability side had also to rise near $3 trillion, as you can see.
Now, during this college lecture, Ben Bernanke stated that the Federal Reserve owned about $800 billion of securities at the beginning of the financial crisis before they purchased $2 trillion of new securities. Now, where did the Federal Reserve get the money to purchase the $2 trillion of new securities? The Federal Reserve created money out of thin air and placed it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. The $2 trillion was created out of thin air. Now, how did the Federal Reserve get the $800 billion of securities that were on the balance sheet before they created money out of thin air to purchase the $2 trillion in new securities? The $800 billion in securities that were on the balance sheet were acquired the same way they acquired the $2 trillion in new securities. They were acquired by creating money out of thin air for the purchase, regardless of when they were purchased. The Federal Reserve purchases securities by creating money out of thin air and placing it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is nothing new. The Federal Reserve has been doing this for many years, but most people don't know this truth. Now remember, according to the Federal Reserve website and the Federal Reserve audio clips, the Federal Reserve purchases securities through creating money out of thin air and placing it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is exactly how the Federal Reserve creates money, out of thin air. Now, since the Federal Reserve can create money out of thin air and place it in the system as a credit to the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank, then the Federal Reserve can create money out of thin air and place it in the system as a $2,000 monthly credit for every United States citizen 18 years of age or older. This Federal Reserve, money from nowhere out of thin air to spur economic growth system can fund $2,000 in monthly government-guaranteed universal basic income, which will stimulate the economy and go a long way towards ending poverty in the United States and eliminate any need for taxpayer dollars to fund this program. In the example on the Federal Reserve website, the Federal Reserve credits the primary securities dealer's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in exchange for the securities. The securities purchased by the Federal Reserve with money created out of thin air are assets, and the bank accounts that receive the funds credited from the securities purchased with money created out of thin air are listed as liability items on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. With added funds in their accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the banks can make more loans to businesses and individuals. Increased borrowing by businesses and individuals results in a boost in spending in the economy. Notice that it's talking about businesses and individuals going into debt through taking out loans, which boosts spending in the economy, but leaves businesses and individuals in debt, which is how the banks earn money, through the interest the banks charge those who take out loans with them. This is a banking system built by capitalists for capitalists, and this is a banking system that is built on monetizing debt, which is a topic for another lecture. And the money to make all of this possible came from nowhere, or in other words, the money to make all of this possible was created out of thin air. How the Federal Reserve creates money is listed in plain sight on the Federal Reserve website for everyone to see, although many people are unaware of these facts. So let's go over this one more time before we move on. Now remember, the Federal Reserve creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealer's bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit comes from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. Remember, money has to come from somewhere in order to be placed into any account as a credit. This is true for everyone except the Federal Reserve System and its purchasing of securities to add liquidity to the banking system. Because of the fact that the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to spur economic growth, this makes the Federal Reserve the perfect vehicle to fund $2,000 in monthly government-guaranteed universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. Now, for those who may cry inflation concerning increasing the money supply to cover $2,000 in government-guaranteed universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. Concerning the money supply and its ties to GDP growth and inflation, the Federal Reserve website states the following information. Over recent decades, however, the relationships between various measures of the money supply and variables such as GDP growth and inflation in the United States have been quite unstable. As a result, the importance of the money supply as a guide for the conduct of monetary policy in the United States has diminished over time. The Federal Open Market Committee, the monetary policy-making body of the Federal Reserve System, still regularly reviews money supply data in conducting monetary policy, but money supply figures are just part of a wide array of financial and economic data that policymakers review. Now, in other words, the instability of the relationship between the money supply and economic variables such as GDP growth and inflation has led to the diminishment of the importance of the money supply as a guide for the conduct of monetary policy in the United States. Now, this information from the Federal Reserve website is a clear and concise answer for those who would worry about inflation because of an increase in the money supply. Also, inflation can be traced historically, and the economy continued to work as inflation has risen throughout the years. Let's look at historical inflation in the United States. According to the Consumer Price Index inflation calculator, located on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, $100 in August 1960 had the same buying power as $878.10 in August 2020. So in this example, a person would have had to spend $878.10 in August 2020 to buy what that person could have bought for $100 in August 1960. So from August 1960 to August 2020, there was a rise totaling $778.10. Now let's cover another example in United States Consumer Price Index history from August 1913 to August 2020. $100 in August 1913 had the same buying power as $2,625.43 in August 2020. So in this example, a person would have had to spend $2,625.43 in August 2020 to buy what that person could have bought for $100 in August 1913. So from August 1913 to August 2020, there was a rise totaling $2,525.43. Now, as this information clearly shows, inflation has gone up over the years, which is nothing new and will continue to happen as history has shown. But the economy has continued to work regardless of inflation. Now, as the Federal Reserve website states, there is instability in the relationship between the money supply and economic variables such as GDP growth and inflation, which diminish the importance of the money supply as a monetary policy guide in the United States. But as a safety precaution against inflation, the $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income will be indexed to inflation as a safeguard for everyone who receives it. As inflation rises, the amount of government guaranteed universal basic income will rise accordingly. In order to see what the Federal Reserve has done since it acquired the ability to create money out of thin air after the ending of the gold standard, let's follow the money beginning in 1971, the year Nixon ended the gold standard. Remember, during the time of the gold standard, there had to be enough gold to cover the value of any increases to the money supply. After Nixon ended the gold standard, there was nothing to cover the value of any increases to the money supply. Remember how the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. The Federal Reserve creates money as a credit into an account that the primary securities dealers bank holds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The money placed into the primary securities dealer's account as a credit comes from nowhere, or in other words, out of thin air. The act of crediting the primary securities dealer's account is the creation of money out of thin air. The Federal Reserve had no money to begin with. In order to begin the process of increasing the money supply, the Federal Reserve, through typing whatever amount it is in need of through some keystrokes, creates the money it needs to purchase the securities in order to increase the money supply. As we follow the money, we'll see money collected in total federal government revenue and money spent in total federal government outlays, including total Federal Reserve outlays. This will show that the Federal Reserve System created money out of thin air to inject cash throughout the years, as more money was spent in total federal outlays, including Federal Reserve outlays, than was collected in total federal government revenue. The following historical data is from the Congressional Budget Office in the Historical Budget Data section, which covers data on revenues, outlays, and the deficit or surplus from 1965 through the most recent year completed. Now, revenues are the money the federal government takes in through individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, excise taxes, estate and gift taxes, custom duties, and miscellaneous receipts. And outlays are the money the federal government spent. The data also shows the amount of federal debt held by the public, which includes federal debt held by Federal Reserve banks. Now, according to TreasuryDirect.gov, the debt held by the public is all federal debt held by individuals, corporations, state or local governments, Federal Reserve banks, foreign governments, and other entities outside the United States government, less federal financing bank securities. Types of securities held by the public include, but are not limited to, Treasury bills, notes, bonds, TIPS, United States savings bonds, and state and local government series securities. Now, I want to emphasize Federal Reserve banks, because the Federal Reserve has been bankrolling the financial sector for years as a result of the consequences of federal deficits. The money has been input at the top of the ladder to the financial sector in an attempt to spur economic growth in order to get people borrowing money, which results in more debt for the people but helps the financial sector tremendously. Let's look at the historical data from the Congressional Budget Office in the Historical Budget Data section, which covers data on revenues, outlays, and the deficit or surplus from 1965 through the most recent year completed. This data clearly shows there were deficits, or in other words, a negative balance, each fiscal year from 1971 until 1998. In 1998, there was a surplus, or in other words, a positive balance for each fiscal year for 4 years, from 1998 to 2001. From 2002 until 2019, there were deficits, or in other words, a negative balance each fiscal year. Out of 48 years, the United States federal government operated 44 years at a deficit each fiscal year, or in other words, a negative balance each fiscal year. And the United States federal government operated at a surplus, or in other words, a positive balance, only 4 years. Now, how did the United States government do this and keep the economy rolling? The Federal Reserve System. And as the Federal Reserve System has been utilized to benefit the rich, the Federal Reserve System will be utilized to benefit the poor and middle class through our proposal for $2,000 in United States monthly government guaranteed universal basic income for citizens at least 18 years of age. In conclusion, I submit to you that when our proposal for $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income for citizens at least 18 years of age becomes law, it will pay for itself and bring positive results for everyone. It will lift the standard of living for Americans throughout the United States. Cities throughout the United States will benefit greatly as numerous homeless Americans leave the streets because they now have an apartment or house to live in. This will lessen the amount of resources needed to address the homeless issue in cities throughout the United States. The real estate industry will benefit greatly from a $2,000 monthly government guaranteed universal basic income program, as Americans who are unemployed and homeless will go to apartment living and rental houses because they will have an income, which will increase the number of residents living in apartments and rental houses and will benefit property owners and management companies as a result. There will be more mortgages as more homes will be bought by Americans, resulting in more business for everyone involved in the real estate industry, from the new home builders to the construction companies to the real estate agents to the banks and mortgage companies. Businesses large and small throughout the United States will see an increase in business, and there will be a rebirth in mom and pop businesses. People who currently would like to start a mom and pop business but are unable to because of finances, receiving $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income would enable them the opportunity to do so. People would be able to freely move into other areas of work if they lost a job due to automation. Another great benefit of $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income concerns those who are incarcerated throughout the United States. Now, the FBI's preliminary semi-annual uniform crime report for January through June of 2019 states the following information. Preliminary figures indicate that law enforcement agencies throughout the nation showed an overall decrease of 3.1% in the number of violent crimes brought to their attention for the first 6 months of 2019 when compared with figures reported for the same time in 2018. The violent crime category includes murder, rape, revised definition, robbery, and aggravated assault. The number of property crimes in the United States from January to June of 2019 dropped 5.6% when compared with data for the same time period in 2018. Property crimes include burglary, larceny, theft, and motor vehicle theft. Arson is also a property crime, but data for arson are not included in property crime totals due to fluctuations in reporting. Figures for the first 6 months of 2019 indicate that arson decreased 12.5% when compared with 2018 figures for the same time period. Now, according to the FBI's preliminary semi-annual uniform crime report for January through June of 2019, there was an overall decrease of 3.1% in the number of violent crimes brought to their attention when compared with the data for the same time period in 2018. Property crimes dropped 5.6% when compared with the data for the same time period in 2018. The crime areas that include lack of income or lack of money as the motivating factor, such as robberies or burglaries, will automatically decrease as a direct result of the $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income. The reported crime percentage decreases of 3.1% for violent crimes and 5.6% for property crimes will decrease much further because of the enactment of the $2,000 monthly government guaranteed universal basic income program, which will be a positive benefit that will be felt throughout the United States. The resources necessary to address the crime areas that include lack of income or lack of money as the motivating factor can be redirected to other necessary areas because of the decrease in crime in these areas. This will have a direct positive impact on United States prisons as the number of people committing crimes in these areas and becoming convicted felons will decrease. The decrease in people becoming convicted felons will automatically have a direct positive effect on United States prisons as the number of people going to prison decrease, which will have a direct positive effect on the recidivism rate in United States prisons. In other words, since the people do not go to prison in the first place, they will undoubtedly not be going back to prison, and as a result, they will not become a statistic in the recidivism rate. Concerning convicted felons in and out of prison, the National Institute of Justice states the following information. Recidivism is one of the most fundamental concepts in criminal justice. It refers to a person's relapse into criminal behavior, often after the person receives sanctions or undergoes intervention for a previous crime. Recidivism is measured by criminal acts that resulted in rearrest, reconviction, or return to prison with or without a new sentence during a 3-year period following the prisoner's release. The National Institute of Justice states the following information. Bureau of Justice Statistics studies have found high rates of recidivism among released prisoners. Examines the recidivism patterns of former prisoners during a 9-year follow-up period, the researchers found that the 401,288 state prisoners released in 2005 had 1,994,000 arrests during the 9-year period, an average of 5 arrests per released prisoner. 60% of these arrests occurred during years 4 through 9. An estimated 68% of released prisoners were arrested within 3 years, 79% within 6 years, and 83% within 9 years. 82% of prisoners arrested during the 9-year period were arrested within the first 3 years. Almost half, 47% of prisoners who did not have an arrest within 3 years of release were arrested during years 4 through 9. 44% of released prisoners were arrested during the first year following release, while 24% were arrested during year 9. Now, this information from the National Institute of Justice shows the need to address the recidivism rate. Convicted felons have a rough time finding employment with a felony on their record. Yet they're expected to make it financially when they're released from prison. This results in recidivism, as some convicted felons return to crime to make it financially, and some convicted felons return to crime to return to prison so they can have food and shelter instead of being homeless on the streets. The recidivism rate for convicted felons in prison and out of prison will decrease because of the enactment of the $2,000 monthly government guaranteed universal basic income program, which is a positive benefit that will be felt throughout the United States. Convicted felons in prison and out of prison are included in the program, as all that is required for the program is United States citizenship. $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income for convicted felons who have paid their debt to society will enable them to start over with an income that will have a direct positive impact on the recidivism rate. Under the program, those who are incarcerated will receive the $2,000 in monthly universal basic income, and it cannot be touched by prison officials. This will result in those who are released from prison having money to begin their lives again. Another positive benefit from our proposal for $2,000 in monthly government guaranteed universal basic income will be in the strength the financial support will give families, resulting in more stable families where children continue to have their mothers and fathers in the home, as divorce rates resulting from poor financial conditions will decrease. People who are struggling financially to make ends meet will receive monthly financial help to make those ends meet, which will make their lives easier, resulting in less financial stress and will stimulate the economy at the same time. As I stated earlier, the $2,000 will not be taxed, but it will be indexed to inflation. So when inflation increases, the amount of money people receive will increase. Also, the amount of $2,000 can be increased through legislation, but it cannot be reduced. And as the Federal Reserve Act states, there is currently no expiration date or repeal date for the Federal Reserve, and there will be no expiration date or repeal date for the universal basic income that will be tied directly to the Federal Reserve. The legislation will specifically utilize the Federal Reserve money creation out of nowhere to spur economic growth system that is currently being utilized to add liquidity to the banking system. And it will also be utilized to add liquidity into the accounts of every United States citizen at least 18 years of age. There are many positive results that will come from enacting this legislation, as the benefits of passing this bill for $2,000 in monthly United States government guaranteed universal basic income for every United States citizen at least 18 years of age far outweigh any liabilities. We thank you for your time. You can purchase this lecture in its entirety at bgmgproductions.com.
This completes our lecture explaining our legislative proposal for $2,000 in monthly United States government guaranteed lifetime universal basic income for all United States citizens at least 18 years of age. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll pick it up next time with a new topic
on Political Facts with Byron Goines
and Michelle Goines.
Talking about universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. We talking about 2 G's a month in the bank. Cash money, bottom up, economics bank. Rich folk with skrill gon' get it too. Money from bottom to top, this the way it do. Fed with no money, credit pushing banks up. Creating money from nothing, top down stuff. Benefiting nobody but the rich folks. A system of capitalism from coast to coast. Time to change up the system, folks had enough. Use the credit injected, running bottom up. Bottom up economics is the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Get the homeless off the streets and a place to live. Bottom up economics got a lot to give. The folks struggling with ends to make ends meet. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Stimulate the economy the right way. Universal basic income all the way. The single mother with kids, what you do? 2 G's per month cash in her pocket cool. Universal basic income cash flow. Economic stimulation, that's the way to go. Money in at the bottom, poor and middle class. Economic stimulation when they spend the cash. Bottom up economics, that's the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. It's time to roll with the bottom up at last. Throw the top down system in the trash. Bottom up economics is what it be. Bottom up universal basic income cheese. Bottom up economics, 2 G's a month. The mission to end poverty, that's what's up. Poor, middle class, rich gon' get the cheese. With the primary focus on the least of these. Bottom up economics is the way it be. Bottom up economics in poverty. Bottom up economics and universal basic income. bgmgproductions.com.